In this next module, we're going to cover Identity and Access Management, or IAM. IAM is a web service that helps you securely control access to AWS resources. You use IAM to control who is authenticated and authorized, or in other words, who is signed in and has permission to use resources. When you first create an AWS account, you begin with a single sign-in identity that has complete access to all AWS services and resources in the account. This identity is called the AWS account root user and is accessed by signing in with the email address and password that you used to create the account. AWS strongly recommends that you don't use the root user for everyday tasks, even the administrative ones. Instead, they recommend adhering to the best practice of using the root user only to create your first IAM user, and then securely lock away the root user credentials. Now, later on in this course, we will create a user and then switch to that user. What are the features of IAM? Well, first, there's shared access, which means that you can grant other people permission to administer and use resources in your AWS account without having to share your password or access key. The next is granular permissions, which means you can grant different permissions to different people for different resources. For example, you might allow some users complete access to Amazon EC2, Simple Storage Service, DynamoDB, or other services, while for other users, you can allow read-only access to just some S3 buckets, or permission to administer just some EC2 instances, or to access your billing information, but nothing else. Next is secure access to AWS resources, which means you can use IAM features to securely provide credentials for applications that run on EC2 instances. These credentials provide permissions for your application to access other AWS resources. When we created our Cloud9 instance earlier in this course, we were giving EC2 permission to access other resources. Next is MFA, or multi-factor authentication, and this is where you can add two-factor authentication to your account and to individual users for extra security. With MFA, you or your users must provide not only a password or access key to work with your account, but also a code from a specially configured device. Next is identity federation, which means that you can allow users who already have passwords elsewhere, for example in your corporate network or with an internet identity provider, to get temporary access to your AWS account. Next, we have identity information for assurance, which is using AWS CloudTrail to receive log records that include information about those who made requests for resources in your account. That information is based on IAM identities, which we'll go over later. AWS IAM also supports PCI DSS compliance and the processing, storage, and transmission of credit card data by a merchant or service provider, and has been validated as being compliant with both PCI and DSS. IAM also integrates with a huge number of other AWS services to make it possible to manage those services as securely as possible. Next, IAM, like many other AWS services, is eventually consistent, which means IAM achieves high availability by replicating data across multiple servers within Amazon's data centers around the world. If a request to change some data is successful, the change is committed and safely stored. However, the change must be replicated across IAM, which can take some time. Such changes include creating or updating users, groups, roles, or policies. And finally, IAM is free, which means it's included in your AWS account at no additional charge. Now, before we go on to create our first user, we should understand a little bit about how IAM works. IAM provides the infrastructure necessary to control authentication and authorization for your account, and it includes the following elements. The first element is the principal, which is an entity that can make a request for an action or operation on an AWS resource. Users, roles, federated users, and applications are all AWS principals. Your AWS account root user is your first principal. As a best practice, once again, we don't use your root user for daily work. Instead, in the future, we're going to create an IAM user. You can also support federated users or programmatic access to allow an application to access your AWS account. Next, we have the request. So when a principal tries to use the AWS Management Console, the API, or the AWS CLI, that principal sends a request to AWS. And that request includes the following information: First is the action or operation, and that is the action or operation that the principal wants to perform. It can be an action in the AWS Management Console or an operation in the CLI or the API. The next piece of information that goes along in the request is the resource, or the AWS resource object upon which the action or operations are performed. Next, the request also includes the principal, or the user, role, federated user, or application that sent the request. Information about the principal includes the policies that are associated with that principal, and we will go over policies in a future video. Next is environment data, or information about the IP address, user agent, SSL-enabled status, or the time of day. And finally, we have resource data, which is data related to the resource that is being requested. This can include information such as a DynamoDB table name tag, or a tag on an Amazon EC2 instance. The next element in the IAM infrastructure is the authentication, which means as a principal you must be authenticated or signed in to AWS to send a request to AWS. Although some services such as S3 and STS allow a few requests from anonymous users, they're the exception to the rule. Authentication in the AWS console just looks like signing in with your username and password. Authentication in the API or the AWS CLI means providing your access key and your secret key, which are two different keys that you get whenever you create a new user, and we will go over that very shortly here. If you've set up multi-factor authentication, then you would need to provide that here as well. The next step in the AWS infrastructure is authorization, and during authorization, AWS uses values from the request context to check for policies that apply to the request. Most policies are stored in AWS as JSON documents and specify the permissions that are allowed or denied for principals. There are several types of policies that can affect whether a request is authorized. Those policies can be categorized as permissions policies or permissions boundaries. Permissions policies define the permissions for the object to which they're attached. These include identity-based policies, resource-based policies, and ACLs. A permissions boundary is an advanced feature that allows you to use policies to limit the maximum permissions that a principal can have. These boundaries can be applied to AWS organizations or to IAM users or roles. The next piece of IAM infrastructure is actions or operations. And once again, these are what gets sent along in the request, and they are the action or operation that the principal wants to perform. And finally, once again, there are the resources, or the resources that the principal wants to perform the actions or operations on. Here's a diagram that should help explain exactly what we just went through. So, once again, at the top left, we'll start with the principal, which again is a user, role, federated user, or application. When they want to make a request, they'll first need to go through authentication, which is getting signed in the console or providing your keys in the AWS CLI or API. You'll then send your request to AWS, and once again, the request includes things like the resource that you want to affect, other request information, and actions and operations, or what you want to do to the resource. AWS will then authorize that request using resource-based policies, identity-based policies, or other policies that we will go over in a future video. If you are authorized, then AWS will send that request through the action phase, which means you'll be able to perform your action on whatever resource you've requested. And finally, you can use identity or resource-based policies to affect resources in other accounts. And if all of that makes sense, then that about wraps it up for this introductory IAM video, so feel free to move on.